I asked, "What if we got caught?" She leaned close, her voice barely a whisper. "Then make it worth the risk." The first time I noticed her, it wasn't dramatic. There was no cinematic reveal, no sudden twist of fate. It was a quiet moment, the kind that lingers long after it passes. She moved through the cafe with an effortless grace, carrying herself as if the world were something she could observe, not be consumed by. She was older than me, older in ways that mattered, in a way that made every glance, every gesture, seem deliberate, confident, and quietly alluring. I was 31, cautious in love, hesitant around intensity, and yet here she was, filling the space without demanding it, drawing attention simply by being present. I remember the way she reached for the book on the shelf beside me, her fingers brushing mine ever so slightly. The contact was fleeting, but it sent a warmth crawling up my arm, a shiver I couldn't ignore. She didn't notice, or maybe she did, there was that faintest flash of awareness in her eyes, but she smiled, a private, teasing smile, and moved on. That smile lingered in my mind longer than it should have, replaying itself as I sipped my coffee, trying to act casual while my chest quietly betrayed me with an uneven rhythm. There was something magnetic about the subtlety of her presence. Her laughter, soft and melodic, seemed to hang in the air long after it had left her lips. When she leaned over to talk to someone else, the curve of her shoulder, the slight tilt of her head, even the way her hair caught the light, all seemed choreographed in a way I couldn't quite name. And yet, there was vulnerability too, a softness hidden beneath her poise. It made her human, approachable, and dangerous all at once. I tried to observe without intruding, to learn without revealing my fascination. I noticed the small details, how she tilted her head when she was listening, how her fingers absent-mindedly traced the edge of a notebook, how her perfume, subtle, comforting, warm, lingered in a way that made the mundane smell of coffee suddenly richer, more intimate. My mind was a careful observer, cataloging each small gesture, each understated motion, knowing that the real intrigue wasn't just in what she did, but in what she left unsaid. Then came the moment, the quietest, simplest moment, that solidified everything. She looked up from her book, our eyes meeting briefly across the table. The world, for a heartbeat, seemed to compress. I noticed the faint spark in her eyes, the way she held my gaze, just long enough for curiosity to bloom into something unspoken yet undeniable. There was a question there, and maybe an invitation, though she didn't need to speak it. My pulse quickened, not from bold gestures or dramatic confessions, but from the quiet thrill of recognition, that here was someone who could see me, really see me, and who stirred something within me that I hadn't yet learned to name. It was the spark, the kind that doesn't scream or demand, but lingers quietly, a heat in the chest and a pull in the gut. That first moment didn't promise love, or even romance. It promised something more dangerous, possibility. And in the subtle dance of glances, gestures, and unspoken awareness, I felt it, the slow-burning, intoxicating thrill of risk. From that moment, nothing was ever quite the same. The days after that first spark were a careful dance of glances, proximity, and unspoken curiosity. Every encounter with her was a reminder of the risk, a subtle thrill that I couldn't fully ignore. She seemed to exist in a space slightly apart from the ordinary, aware of every detail, and yet playful enough to let me catch glimpses of her world. I was 31, cautious, aware of consequences, and painfully aware of the difference in our lives. She was older, established, confident, and graceful in ways that highlighted my hesitations. And still, every time I saw her, the pull was undeniable. It started with small touches, almost accidental, but each carried a weight that was hard to measure. When she handed me a folder at work, our fingers brushed, just for a second, but I felt a jolt, a warmth spreading from my palm up to my chest. She didn't recoil or apologize, instead, her eyes lingered on mine, subtle yet deliberate, as if daring me to notice. It was in these small, quiet gestures that the tension began to weave itself between us, a tension I could feel in my shoulders, in my heartbeat, in the slightly uneven rhythm of my breathing. Her presence had a way of reshaping ordinary moments into something charged. Even in a crowded room, when laughter and conversation swirled around us, there was a gravity pulling me toward her. I caught her watching me from across the room, the corner of her mouth hinting at a smile that said more than words ever could. I tried to look away, to act natural, but the pull of her gaze held me in place. And then, the smallest, almost imperceptible movement, a tilt of her head, a lean slightly closer, made me realize that she was aware of my awareness, that she, too, felt the silent tension crackling in the air. Inside, my mind raced. Every thought carried caution and desire in equal measure. She's older. She's experienced. She knows what this could mean. But the very thought of turning away felt impossible. I noticed the way her fingers traced the rim of her coffee cup, how her hair fell softly against her shoulder, how the light caught her eyes in a way that made the world seem smaller, quieter, more intimate. These were dangerous details, subtle, beautiful, and magnetic. And then, inevitably, came the words I hadn't expected, whispered as if sharing a secret meant just for me. What if we got caught? Her voice was soft, teasing, yet threaded with something electric, something that made every nerve ending alert. I felt the thrill in her words, the invitation, the challenge. It wasn't reckless, it was measured, intentional. And yet, my chest tightened with the weight of it, because desire and propriety collided violently inside me. Every interaction after that became a careful negotiation. I found myself imagining the brush of her hand against mine, replaying fleeting touches, and memorizing the way her laughter lingered. The risk wasn't just real, it was delicious, tantalizing, and wholly irresistible. We were both aware of the line we shouldn't cross, and yet, the magnetic pull of proximity and curiosity made it nearly impossible to maintain distance. Forbidden awareness is a strange thing. It sharpens the senses, heightens every touch, glance, and word. And in her presence, I was acutely aware of the cost, and the temptation. The thrill of the risk was as real as the warmth of her hand brushing mine, and I knew, deep down, that this was only the beginning. It happened gradually, almost imperceptibly, as though the universe was conspiring to shrink the world until it consisted of just the two of us. One evening, I found myself working late, alone in the quiet hum of the office, the soft glow of desk lamps casting long shadows across the room. She appeared, casually, naturally, as if she belonged there, and yet every instinct in me told me this encounter was anything but ordinary. There was a thrill in the unexpected, in the way her presence turned the mundane into something charged, something dangerous and magnetic. We were seated across from each other, a project sprawled between us, and I became aware of the smallest details, the way her fingers brushed the edge of the papers, how she occasionally leaned closer, her shoulder nearly touching mine under the pretense of examining a document. Every accidental touch was deliberate in its effect, a gentle nudge toward proximity. And yet, it wasn't vulgar or overt, it was charged with subtle electricity. My pulse quickened with each fleeting contact, a warmth spreading from my chest to my hands, the simple pressure of her fingers leaving echoes long after she moved away. Then came the moment that lingered in my mind long after it passed. She whispered, just close enough for me to catch it, her voice low and intimate, "What if we got caught?" The words were playful, teasing, and yet threaded with a kind of daring that made my heartbeat stutter. I could feel the heat in her words, the subtle invitation that carried the thrill of risk. My mind raced, torn between prudence and the undeniable pull of temptation. But the truth was inescapable. I was drawn to her in a way that went beyond fascination or curiosity. The office, once a neutral space, seemed to shrink around us. The hum of computers, the soft tapping of keyboards, even the muted city sounds outside the window faded into the background. There was only her, and the quiet gravity she exerted without trying, and me, struggling to remain composed while every nerve in my body demanded attention. Her hair fell lightly over her shoulder as she leaned in, her breath brushing my ear, sending a shiver down my spine. The warmth of her proximity was intoxicating, grounding yet electric. And then there were the touches that were almost imperceptible, a brush of knees beneath the table, a hand adjusting a stray strand of hair from my forehead, a finger lightly tracing the edge of a notebook. Each motion carried intention, unspoken yet impossible to ignore. I became acutely aware of the tension in the air, the magnetic pull of closeness, and the delicate line we both knew existed. Every glance, every hesitant smile, every brush of skin held a weight I could feel deep in my chest. It was temptation in its purest form, subtle, intimate, and dangerous. Not in the way that breaks boundaries overtly, but in the way that lingers, building quietly, fiercely, in stolen moments and fleeting touches. The risk was real, and so was the desire. In that space, I realized that the attraction between us had grown beyond curiosity or admiration. It had become a slow-burning, irresistible force, and I was powerless to resist it. Even as we returned to our tasks, the thrill remained, a quiet hum in my chest. The unspoken challenge hung between us, teasing, daring, promising that the moments to come would only grow more profound, more intimate, and more impossible to ignore. The temptation had been undeniable, but desire alone is never enough to sustain a connection. What changed that evening wasn't a touch or a whisper, but the quiet, deliberate step into each other's emotional space. We found ourselves alone in a small, dimly lit café, a rare moment where the world outside, the noise, the judgments, the responsibilities, seemed distant, almost irrelevant. She sat across from me, her posture relaxed, yet there was an openness in her eyes I hadn't seen before. Something about the way she looked at me invited honesty, and I felt an unexpected trust rising within me. I began to speak, cautiously at first, revealing fragments of myself I usually kept hidden, my fears of inadequacy, the hesitations I carried because of my inexperience, the quiet longing for someone who could see me without judgment. I spoke not because I expected sympathy, but because the space between us made silence unbearable. Her eyes softened as I talked, her gaze unwavering yet gentle, and in that moment I understood something crucial. She wasn't just a temptation, she was a confidant, someone who could meet me in my vulnerability and respond with understanding rather than judgment. She smiled, not the playful, teasing smile of before, but a warm, knowing smile that held its own quiet strength. Slowly, she shared pieces of her life, her struggles and insecurities woven beneath the fabric of confidence she displayed to the world. There was a softness in her voice as she recounted moments of doubt, the challenges she had faced, and the loneliness she sometimes carried despite her composed exterior. Each word, each confession, felt deliberate yet unforced, a way of inviting me closer into the private corners of her heart. Physical closeness accompanied the emotional intimacy, subtle but electric. She brushed a stray lock of hair from my forehead, her fingers lingering slightly longer than necessary. I could feel the warmth of her hand, the steady pulse beneath her skin, and the quiet comfort of her proximity. When she shifted to lean in slightly, our shoulders touched, grounding us in a shared moment that was both tender and charged. It wasn't overt, it wasn't reckless, but it was a language of its own, one spoken through glances, the brush of skin, and the steady rhythm of shared breaths. Every gesture deepened the connection, building a trust that felt rare, almost sacred. Her vulnerability mirrored mine, creating a balance between risk and safety, desire and restraint. In that space, words became less important. It was the quiet understanding, the mutual acknowledgement of longing tempered by respect, that defined the moment. By the end of the evening, I realized that the attraction between us had evolved. It was no longer only about the thrill of forbidden risk or the subtle temptation of physical closeness. It had grown into something deeper, an emotional resonance that made each glance, each touch, and each word matter in ways I hadn't anticipated. I was no longer just drawn to her body or her presence, I was drawn to her mind, her heart, and the quiet strength beneath her grace. In leaving, our hands brushed again, a lingering touch that spoke of unspoken promises. That evening, I understood the power of emotional intimacy, how it could elevate desire into something profound, anchoring the slow burn that had begun to kindle between us. And in her eyes, I glimpsed the same understanding, the quiet acknowledgement that we were stepping into something far more complex and beautiful than either of us had imagined. The air was crisp that evening, carrying the faint scent of rain on the pavement, a quiet reminder that the world outside still existed, though it felt distant. We were alone on the rooftop of her apartment building, a small, private space that seemed to exist just for us. The city stretched below, lights twinkling like scattered stars, but up here, everything else faded into the background. It was a rare moment of solitude, a fragile bubble where the tension between us could finally take shape without interference. She leaned against the railing, her eyes catching mine, and for a moment, the playful teasing of before transformed into something weightier. The subtle electricity between us had been simmering for days, weeks even, and now it pressed against the edges of restraint. I was acutely aware of the age difference, of the caution we both carried, of the unspoken rules and the risk of being caught. But in her gaze, there was a daring promise, an invitation that was impossible to ignore. Then she whispered, barely audible, yet clear enough to make my pulse quicken, "Then make it worth the risk." The words were deliberate, full of warmth and challenge, a mixture of playfulness and gravity. I felt the weight of them, the thrill and danger wrapped together, as though a line had been drawn, and we were choosing to step across it together. My heart hammered, my hands tingled, but I couldn't stop myself from moving closer, drawn by a force both tender and irresistible. Our first contact was deliberate yet gentle. I reached for her hand, my fingers brushing against hers in a tentative, almost reverent touch. She didn't pull away, instead, she intertwined her fingers with mine, the warmth of her palm pressing against my own, steadying and thrilling me at once. The simplicity of the gesture belied its intensity, no words were necessary, because the connection was in the electricity of our touch, the shared awareness of risk and desire. I felt her presence fully then, the subtle rise and fall of her chest, the warmth radiating from her skin, the faint scent of her hair carried by the breeze. We leaned closer, shoulders touching lightly, a deliberate but safe closeness that made the world shrink around us. Every movement, every glance, every heartbeat was amplified in that suspended space. Her eyes held mine with quiet insistence, communicating trust, curiosity, and invitation all at once. For the first time, the thrill of forbidden attraction became tangible, embodied in a simple, human gesture, hands held, eyes locked, breath mingling in the space between us. It was intimate, yes, but safe, the kind of intimacy that lingers, that resonates, that leaves an indelible mark without crossing boundaries. In that moment, the risk became real, but so did the reward, a shared acknowledgement of desire and trust, a slow-burn connection that neither of us wanted to end. As we finally stepped back from the railing, our fingers reluctantly separating, the memory of that touch stayed with me. It was a quiet victory, a milestone in a journey that had been building subtly, beautifully, and dangerously. The thrill of risk, combined with the warmth of connection, was intoxicating. For the first time, I understood that desire didn't need recklessness to be powerful. Sometimes, the most profound risks are measured, deliberate, and shared. And in that shared silence, I realized, this was only the beginning. The exhilaration of the risk we had taken lingered in my chest like a secret flame, but reality has a way of creeping in, even in the quietest of moments. The thrill of proximity and shared touches was intoxicating, yet it came with its own weight, whispers of judgment, raised eyebrows, and the constant awareness that our connection existed in a delicate balance. The world outside our private bubble didn't pause. Colleagues, friends, and societal expectations reminded me at every turn that what we were building was as fragile as it was intoxicating. I noticed the subtle glances first. A coworker catching our hands brush, a friend tilting their head in quiet curiosity, the occasional raised eyebrow at the way we lingered near each other. Nothing was overt, nothing demanded confrontation, but the awareness of observation created a tension that prickled the skin. Every glance she cast my way carried not only desire but also the silent acknowledgement of risk, and it made my pulse tighten. We were navigating a forbidden space, one where even a fleeting touch carried weight beyond the immediate thrill. Internally, I wrestled with my own doubts. I asked myself questions I didn't always want answers to. Am I overstepping? Is this too reckless? What would happen if someone misunderstood? Each thought collided with the undeniable truth of how I felt, the warmth I felt when her hand lingered against mine, the quiet steadiness of her shoulder brushing against me, the thrill of her whispered words that haunted my mind long after she spoke them. Desire and prudence warred in me, creating an ache that was impossible to ignore. She, too, carried her own shadows of hesitation. I noticed the way she hesitated before reaching for my hand in public, a flicker of self-consciousness in her eyes that contradicted her usual confidence. There were moments when her laughter, though warm and inviting, was tinged with a quiet tension, as if she, too, felt the weight of being caught. And yet, in the private moments, the accidental brush of knees under a table, the lingering hand on the small of my back, she let the tension slip just enough to remind me that what we shared was undeniable, and worth the quiet struggle. The push and pull of public caution and private intimacy created a strange, intoxicating rhythm. Every stolen glance across a crowded room became an electric current, every incidental touch magnified into a heartbeat. The risk was no longer abstract, it was felt in the subtle awareness of other eyes, in the quickening of pulses when proximity grew too close, and in the almost imperceptible moments of hesitation before a hand was finally placed in another's. Yet, despite the tension, or perhaps because of it, our connection deepened. The uncertainty forced us to communicate in a language beyond words, lingering looks, tentative touches, and the careful choreography of proximity and distance. In navigating the line between risk and desire, we discovered a mutual understanding, a trust that was forged not in recklessness, but in the deliberate choice to be present for one another, even under scrutiny. By the end of this chapter, the thrill of risk had evolved into something more profound, a recognition that connection, when tempered with caution and respect, could survive scrutiny and expectation. And in that recognition, the slow burn between us grew stronger, ready to move toward its inevitable, tender culmination. The world felt softer that evening, as if the city itself had taken a step back to let us exist in our own quiet orbit. After weeks of subtle glances, lingering touches, and stolen conversations, we finally allowed ourselves to step beyond hesitation. The risk had been acknowledged, tested, and embraced, and now there was only the reward, the steady warmth of connection and the quiet joy of being together without pretense or restraint. We walked side by side through a small park near her apartment, the night air cool against our skin. The lights overhead cast a gentle glow, illuminating her features in a way that made every detail more vivid, the curve of her smile, the sparkle in her eyes, the subtle sway of her hair as she moved. I noticed the small things I hadn't before, the way her hand brushed mine in casual alignment, the rhythm of her breathing that seemed to echo my own, the soft pressure of her shoulder when we paused to admire a fountain. Each moment was deliberate and effortless, a reminder that intimacy doesn't always need words. She reached for my hand, fingers entwining with mine naturally, the warmth of her palm pressing against mine in a quiet assertion of belonging. It wasn't urgent or demanding, it was steady, grounding, and profoundly intimate. The thrill of forbidden attraction had softened into something richer, something that blended desire with trust, tension with tenderness. Every touch, every glance, every shared smile carried the weight of the journey we had taken together, from curiosity and temptation to vulnerability and courage. We paused on a quiet bench, sitting close enough for shoulders to brush, for the faint warmth of her presence to seep into me. Her head tilted slightly toward me, and for the first time, there was no teasing, no playful challenge, only the unspoken acknowledgement of what we had built together. Our conversation flowed easily, laughter punctuating thoughtful pauses, words intertwined with the subtler language of glances, hands, and breath. The age difference that had once felt like a barrier now felt like context. It gave depth to her confidence, nuance to my hesitations, and perspective to the mutual respect that had grown between us. There was a moment when I noticed her fingers tracing the edge of my hand, tentative yet deliberate, a simple gesture that conveyed more than words ever could. The quiet intimacy of it, the unhurried way she leaned slightly closer, made me realize that the slow burn had reached its peak not in dramatic gestures, but in these measured, human moments of closeness. It was a love forged not in haste, but in patience, attention, and care, a love that respected boundaries while quietly transcending them. As we finally stood to leave, our fingers remained intertwined, hands warm, pulses steady. The city around us hummed with distant life, but it felt peripheral, a background to the private resonance we shared. In her eyes, I saw the reflection of my own journey, the hesitation, the temptation, the vulnerability, and finally, the embrace of risk that led us to this quiet, perfect equilibrium. For the first time, the attraction, the thrill, and the intimacy coalesced into something fully realized, a connection that was both tender and electrifying, mature and deeply human. And as we walked together into the night, the world seemed a little softer, a little kinder, and infinitely richer, because we had chosen each other, and the slow burn had finally found its flame. If this slow burn romance captured your heart, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell, so you won't miss the next story where passion, risk, and emotion collide. Share your thoughts in the comments. Would you take the risk if it felt this real?